been thrilled to find an affordable apartment in the heart of the city. It was a small, cozy one-bedroom in an old building, and her landlord was a pleasant older woman named Mrs. Turner. When Sarah first moved in, Mrs. Turner had given her a quick tour of the place, showing her around the creaky hallways and introducing her to the building's quirks. One thing Mrs. Turner had pointed out was the basement. She told Sarah it was off-limits, but if she ever heard strange noises, it was probably just the old pipes clanking. Sarah thought nothing of it at the time. It was an old building, after all, and with rent as low as it was, she was willing to ignore a few creaks and groans. For the first few weeks, everything was great. Sarah was settling into her new job, her new apartment felt cozy, and she even made a couple of friends in the neighborhood. But as time went on, she began to notice strange sounds coming from below her apartment, especially at night. The sounds started as faint noises, soft shuffling, quiet murmuring, and sometimes, what sounded like distant footsteps. They were easy enough to ignore at first, but as the weeks passed, they grew louder and harder to dismiss. One night, as she was lying in bed, she heard what sounded like scratching against the floor beneath her. She lay still, listening closely. It almost sounded as if someone, or something, was dragging their nails across the ceiling of the basement. Unsettled, she decided to mention it to Mrs. Turner the next day. "Oh, that's probably just the pipes," Mrs. Turner replied with a reassuring smile. "This old place makes all kinds of noises." Sarah wanted to believe her, but the noises continued, growing stranger and more frequent. One night, she was jolted awake by a loud thud, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor below her. She got out of bed, heart pounding, and pressed her ear to the floor. She could make out faint voices. One was a low, almost growling tone, while the other sounded pleading and desperate. Unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, Sarah went downstairs to investigate. The basement door was at the end of a dark hallway, partially hidden in shadow. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She knew she wasn't supposed to go down there, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed help. Slowly, she twisted the doorknob and pulled the door open. The smell hit her immediately, a musty, stale odor mixed with something metallic. She wrinkled her nose, but curiosity drove her forward. She descended the creaky wooden steps, each one groaning under her weight. At the bottom, she found herself in a dark, damp room, lit only by a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw rows of cardboard boxes stacked against the walls, old furniture draped in dusty sheets, and piles of forgotten junk. But then, something caught her eye, a shadow moving in the far corner of the basement. She froze, her heart racing, as a figure slowly emerged from the darkness. It was a man, hunched and thin, with wild eyes and unkempt hair. His clothes were ragged, and his skin looked pale and sickly. He stared at her, his eyes wide and terrified, and then he whispered, "Help me." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed from the top of the stairs. Mrs. Turner appeared, her face a mask of cold fury. She was holding a heavy metal key in one hand and a small bundle in the other. "Sarah," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I told you the basement was off limits." Sarah was thrilled with her affordable apartment, until she started hearing strange sounds from the basement. When she asked Mrs. Turner, her elderly landlord, she was told, "Just old pipes." But the noises only got louder, scraping, shuffling, and what sounded like muffled cries. One night, Sarah's curiosity got the better of her, and she snuck down to investigate. There, in the basement's shadows, she found a man chained to the wall, gaunt and terrified. As she moved closer, Mrs. Turner appeared, blocking the stairs, her face emotionless. Who is he?" Sarah stammered. Mrs. Turner's face softened, almost pitying. "He's like you," she said. Someone with nowhere else to go. Sarah's mind raced with dread as Mrs. Turner continued, I take care of my tenants. They never leave, they never suffer, so long as they stay where they belong. Desperate, Sarah swung a broken piece of wood at Mrs. Turner, sprinted back up the stairs, and fled the building. That night, she packed what she could, moved to a new part of town, and tried to forget. But soon, messages began appearing on her phone from an unknown number. Each one read the same, chilling line, you can never leave.
Трава работала, перекопала. Ай, сектор, по лесу, ой, сектор, по лесу.